So when we think about culture, we're generally thinking about companies that have got several employees and starting to think about how that culture impacts creativity. And so the one thing that's really key here is about creative leadership. And without creative leadership and driving a whole culture that reflects how the business wants to operate, is going to be really difficult to engender creativity in individuals. So there are two factors really to that leadership. The key thing that the research shows to driving creative culture is trust. Because without trust, you really can't have many of the other things that are required, not just for creative leadership, but actually leadership in general. So with trust comes the ability to be able to debate, dissent, the ability to take risks and not worry that you're going to be penalised for doing that. And it's how the organisation and how the management deal with individuals and teams being able to take risks and actually potentially fail. Most of the time in companies, we're not encouraged to take risks and fail because actually that's not what the organisation on a day-to-day basis needs. But in order to drive creativity, potentially challenge the status quo and break out of the conventions of thinking perhaps in your category or the space that you're in, then you need to find a way to allow people to be able to challenge and be able to do things that might not always work. And so trust is absolutely fundamental there. You also need to have a vision so that you can lead your people. And I interviewed several creative leaders in the book. Keith Reinhard, Chairman Emeritus of DDB, one of the world's best advertising agencies, and Jackie Linton, who's former head of transformation in the NHS. Two completely different perspectives, but both talk about the absolutely fundamental need for leadership in trying to create a culture for creativity, or that charge will fail. So the idea of creative maverick is one that's very much embedded in our society. The idea that you have to, or potentially are slightly out of left field, doing things differently, maybe a slightly wild-haired, we think of a slightly wild-haired scientist in a coat. And we think of that idea of, the Johnny Rotten inside all of us and rebelling. And to a certain extent, if you're going to challenge the status quo, whatever industry or space that you work in, then you do need an aspect of rebellion, but it's by no means the only thing that is a useful characteristic. I interviewed lots of different people for the book and came across people in all sorts of different fields who you could be said to be rebelling in their industry, but in a really interesting way. So Rupert and Claire Callender call themselves the Rebel Undertakers, and they work in the West Country in the UK and are looking to tear up the rule book on how the funeral industry operates and doing things really differently. So they're challenging in their space, and they actively and openly say that they're rebelling. But in order to be creative, you can be rebellious, but you've also got to show other characteristics, including discipline. And if you're going to try and do it repeatedly in business, then you need to practice too. So there are lots of different aspects and parts to being rebellious, but being rebellious by itself is rarely going to be enough.